Was thermite the main cause of the building collapse? Once again, there is a way to find out. Emertech calculated a controlled experiment to see if thermite was a viable option in the collapse of the towers.
Today we're going to be going through a column that's only 8 inches by 6 inches by about ½ inch thick. So compared to the World Trade Center columns, it's really puny, and we're still using over 100 pounds of thermite to try to burn through it. To get thermite to burn into metal, you have to hold it in place and let the heat transfer into the metal. So to put it on column, you have to build something that will hold this basically molten metal against the column long enough for it to do some good.
The demolition team designs a 4-sided flange and welds it onto the column. Since thermite is not explosive, it must be held in tight contact with the column until it heats up enough to melt the steel. Clay is added to the flange and the welds to protect them from the heat and focus the melting action on the column.
You want to talk to him when we get back? The thermite is not going to explode. It's not going to cause a boom. What you're going to see is basically a fire. It's going to be a much slower process.
The team scaled their experiment to see if the steel column, somewhat smaller than those in the World Trade Center, could be sheared with 175 pounds of commercial-grade thermite. If thermite melts through this steel column, the theory of a thermite-controlled demolition may have some validity. While the truthers insist that more explosive super thermite could have been used in the tower demolitions, testing conventional thermite can illuminate this physical process and answer a simple question. Can thermite of any type burn through steel beams?
Lining it with clay wasn't a total success. You can see where the clay broke off, but it looks like most of the material just basically boiled out, and we did not get that heating action that we wanted on the column.
Despite 175 pounds of thermite packed around the steel column, it remained undamaged. Our results seem clear. If thermite can't melt this small column, it wouldn't have had a chance to melt through the much larger columns in the Twin Towers. Not surprisingly, the truthers questioned these results. While Stephen Jones envisions an easy thermite application, Emertech asserts that even if this military substance could be found, it still would not have been practical to use.
If you take just a thin layer of thermite, it'd be tough to light to begin with, but even if you did, it's just going to flash, and there's hardly any energy there.
So is the argument then, oh, well, even though you find super thermite looking residue, it doesn't make sense, so we just won't do an investigation. We'll just kind of ignore the residues that you found that blow up today because we can't figure out how they could do it, and therefore we don't have to look.
And the debunking websites say the thermite would have also needed to cut sideways. Not an easy feat for thermite. You see, it's a powder which burns chaotically. Maybe with some device, but no working device has been proven to me to work to cut a vertical column. So we are led to believe that thermitic material cannot melt steel, cut steel horizontally or vertically, and would take massive amounts to do any real damage. So who's right in this great thermate debate? NIST and the media? Or the independent researchers and scientists who stand nothing to gain? It's time we conduct our own experiments to answer these questions. Can thermitic material melt steel? Can it cut horizontally or vertically? And does it take massive quantities to do any real damage? Many wide flange beams were also used in the construction of the towers, connected in a variety of ways. Could thermite cut or weaken such a connection? Using the same beam from my eutectic steel video and another 12-inch beam, I proceeded to make a double-angle welded connection, which I set up on some 8-inch concrete slabs. I could not obtain nanothermite, so I made small quantities of old-fashioned thermate, which is not considered an explosive, with ingredients that are legal and readily available. Thermate is difficult to ignite, and ordinary fuse is not hot enough. But a magnesium strip, which burns white hot, will ignite the thermate giving off heat and white smoke. NIST mentions bright white flames. Almost immediately, a bright spot appeared at the top of the window on the 80th floor. An unusual flame is visible within this fire. The upper photograph of a very bright white flame stands out. And let's listen to an eyewitness who was there.
I was on the 81st floor.
Tell me what you saw and heard.
It just, I had 40 people in there, just an explosion. There's a light flash out my window, my whole doorway to the entrance of my office blew open.
Could these white flashes be some sort of igniter for the thermitic material? In addition to giving off heat and white smoke, thermate produces lots of small spheres of iron. These iron spheres are a natural byproduct of thermate and not from any steel. Just like those iron spheres found all through the dust. I'm an engineer who designs and builds things, and I'm certainly no explosive expert. My first problem was to find a container that could hold the thermate long enough to melt the steel while not melting itself. I didn't think that steel would work as a container, so I had to improvise using some normal roof tile that I cut in half. I then had to devise a way to hold it against the connection. I used strong magnets and a spring tooth from a hay rake to press 5 pounds of thermite on each side of the double angle connection. I lit the thermate. And it did absolutely nothing to the steel connection. Maybe thermate cannot melt steel, and maybe National Geographic was right. But the steel did not melt, meaning that perhaps a container could be made out of steel after all. Using an ordinary steel box tube, I had a slot milled along one edge. Welding the bottom and using clamps on the top to hold the powdered thermate in, I bolted it to a steel beam vertically. I called this device my thermitic box cutter. With only 1.5 pounds of thermate, or less than 1/100th of what the National Geographic experts used for their experiment. Not only was I able to melt steel, but it also sliced a vertical cut. So I made a slightly larger thermitic box cutter and used 2 3/8 bolts drilled and tapped on one side of the connection. It only took a slight twist to break it completely off. I noticed as the thermate burned, it tended to lose its cutting power, perhaps because it could expand into the area where the box cutter previously burned. So I built a piston-driven box cutter using a compressed car hatch piston. I added sheets of tungsten to minimize the burnout and allow the piston to slide better. I then bolted my contraption to the flange of the column and ignited the white-hot magnesium. It appears that not only can thermate melt steel, but it can also cut vertical columns. So why bother to use incendiaries like thermate and not high explosives? I think it's all about keeping things quiet before the main event. Using thermate may take longer to weaken such large columns in the towers, which may be why we see the molten steel several minutes before its final destruction. Here is less than 1 3/4 pounds of thermate, or 1/100th of what National Geographic used, quietly burning. And here is less than 4 pounds of thermate focused on the web of a wide flange. Which can also be set up on a vertical column. The web was reduced in thickness, with gaping holes, thinned to almost razor sharpness, with a Swiss cheese appearance. NIST rarely mentioned explosions except to say that they didn't exist. Instead, they used the politically correct terms pressure pulses and dust puffs. Repeated pressure pulses. The sources for the pressure pulses and/or dust puffs are unknown. The series of pressure pulses. Perhaps we are seeing a pressure pulse in this video. Rather than using a mechanical piston to maintain volume, I segmented my box cutter with steel plates hoping to get a more uniform burn, but got some unexpected results. Can Thermate make pressure pulses and/or dust puffs? I guess it can. But why waste all that Thermate and energy cutting the columns? Why not attack the weakest areas instead? Can Thermate cut bolts? I guess it can. But what if just the head of the bolt is exposed rather than the nut and the threads? Can Thermate be configured to cut just the bolt head? I guess it can. And without any evidence on the other side. I don't think that something like my piston-driven box cutter was bolted to the office walls, or trash bags full of Thermite used. It's more likely that any pre-weakening thermitic material were hidden inside the perimeter box columns. I had a replica of a segment of the WTC box columns made up, and like the Trade Center iron workers, I bolted the segments together. It made 2 sets of my 2 bolt blasters, placing them in the access hole. Let's listen to another eyewitness.
Like, it sounded like gunfire, you know, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden, 3 big explosions.
Is it even possible that Thermate could do this? I guess it is. I made a 4-sided box cutter split in 2 pieces so they could be inserted inside the column. I held it up on the burnt-out bolt blasters and thought I could hold it down with magnets. Let's see what happens. I think my box cutter blew about 30 feet up, consuming valuable energy and trimming my tree in the process. Nevertheless, the inside of the column was cut about 3/4 of the way through. Were thermitic devices or maybe explosive nanothermite sprayed inside those box columns? I'm not sure. And I'm not sure why this handhold is so large. Or why the side of this box column looks like it's blown outward. Or why 3 columns have a more intense glow, followed by 6 columns that don't, followed by another 3 that do. But I have an idea. But I do know that it's impossible for jet fuel or an office fire to melt steel or iron, which means the official story is wrong. Yet despite all the overwhelming evidence of explosions in molten steel, some people will still believe that this is aluminum and believe Building 7 fell naturally from an office fire. But those people will believe anything. Meanwhile, the government lies while the media hides the truth about 9/11.
Can thermite of any type burn through steel beams?
I guess it can. Isn't it time we use physical science rather than political science to investigate 9/11?